If you would come in and get a book and turn to 401. 401. We'll sing the first and the third verse before our announcements and Bible study this morning. 401. Live for Jesus, oh my brother, his disciple ever be. Render not to any other what alone the Lord should be. Live for Jesus, live for Jesus, give him all thou hast to give. On the cross the world's Redeemer gave his life that thou mightst live. Live for Jesus in life's morning, at the noontide hour be his, and at eve when day is turning, and inherit endless bliss. Live for Jesus, live for Jesus, give him all thou hast to give. On the cross the world's Redeemer gave his life that thou mightst live. Let's go to our Father in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for all that you do for us in this life, Father. Be with us as we enter our Bible study. May we use the things that will be said this morning to grow stronger to you, to have our faith increase, Father, our knowledge increased, and then therefore our wisdom to live closer to you each day. Be with us as we go through our lives. God, guard and protect us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
My whiskers knocked that fuzzy thing off my microphone. You gonna get it for me? I don't care what Debbie says. You're a pretty good fella. Well, oh me. Good morning. How's everybody doing today? Doing all right, son. Let's see what we got here. Larry Gibson passed away. His funeral will be tomorrow at Anderson's at 1 o'clock. Harlan Crabtree, he also passed away. That's Louise's brother. His service will be Thursday in Maryland. He'll be brought back here to Tennessee for his burial. St. Thomas is Jerry Wilson. I don't know what he's doing there. Does anybody? Huh? Has to do with his heart. His heart? Oh, man. At home sick, Ben and Sheldon Young, Tiana and DeLynn Strong, and Peggy Anderson had eye surgery yesterday, asking for prayers. It will be 6 weeks before we know if it did good. I am at home. Are there any others we need to add to our prayer list? Okay, we're studying we haven't studied 2 Corinthians. I'm not working, so.
Is it on?
Yeah. don't trust me. Yeah. We're looking at some of the things, characteristics of Paul, mostly from the things he discussed in this letter. He covered a variety of subjects, but just a few he covered in great detail. The most extensive, I suppose, would be his teaching on suffering. If you want to learn about suffering, go to 2 Corinthians. Paul goes into a lot of detail on that. And you probably find what you're looking for. I got her now, son. Well, I had it for a minute. It's dead again. There he goes, I think. Was that me? No, that was you. Was that me? Oh, it's blinking up at the top. I don't know what that means. I've never seen a battery go bad on one of them before. It must be where you're closer than me, reckon? Oop, I got it. Yeah, it don't work every time, though. What we were looking at last week were some of the advantages to troubles in the world. Last week we were discussing the validity of believers' faith. This is probably the one we're most familiar with. The thing we learn most about ourselves is what kind of faith we've got. A lot of folks, I've seen it through the years, you probably have too, a lot of folks lose their faith, lose what faith they have, I guess I should say. They find out how weak their faith actually was because they become angry with the Lord, as though it were his problem, his fault that we suffer. A lot of Bible characters, they believe the same thing. Were these people inspired of God? They were. Were they wrong? They were. Just because they were inspired Bible characters, that doesn't mean they didn't sin. They did sin. That's one of the reasons it's recorded for us, so we can see their sins, where they failed, where they had a weak faith, even though they were a prophet. Habakkuk, for example, he had a weak faith and a gross misunderstanding of God's people. And that's pointed out to us in his little letter that was written. We learn something about ourselves when we look at these other characters. But the quality of our faith is, to me, first and foremost, most important as to what I learn about myself. Because several times through the years, I've realized that my faith wasn't as strong as it could have been, should have been. And I had to go to work on it to improve my faith. I felt abandoned. I felt as though the Lord wasn't listening. I felt as though prayer wasn't really real. I prayed, but nobody was really listening. And why would God listen to me? Who am I? And all kinds of thoughts go through your head. But suffering brings those questions on. And it's important because it lets us see what our faith is actually like. We could, suppose the Lord did nothing and allowed us to find out what our faith is like in the day of the judgment. Here we are going through life without a care, thinking our faith is so great. And then we stand there in the judgment only to find out that our faith wasn't much. There's got to be tests along the way where I can see that my faith is weak, or I can see this problem or that problem in my life. And that gives me time to correct those problems before I meet the Lord in the judgment. So these tests, I mean, hey, nobody wants to suffer, but it's important. It really plays an important role in our life. And the best thing for us to do is just man up and accept it. You know, this is going to be life, and learn to deal with it when it comes our way. I should have known that was Roy. Anyway, let's move on a little bit. We were talking about manna last week. There's one more point I wanted to make about it. Exodus 16:4. The Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you." That, of course, we know as manna. The people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. The test, and this is one thing I think so many people don't really understand, is that all God's commands are tests. We are tested through the commands. How many times have you heard a person say that baptism for remission of sins makes no sense at all because you can't wash away sin? What's baptism really got to do with taking away sin? Everybody knows you can't literally wash it away. It's foolish to even think such things, to think that baptism is essential. Well, it's a decent question in some respects. So what is the purpose of baptism? You know, it doesn't literally wash away sin. So what makes it such a big deal? See if we'll do it. That's all it is. The Lord said, be baptized for the remission of sins. The $64 question, will you do it because Jehovah said it? That's what it all comes down to, something just that simple. I've always been amazed at the opposition to baptism. I've never really understood it. I used to believe it was okay to be sprinkled until I found out that the Bible actually commands immersion. Well, once I seen that the Bible commanded immersion, then you're supposed to be immersed. But what makes it such a big deal? Jesus said, do it. Will you do it? That's why God gave Israel a quota. You can ask the same questions about manna as you ask about baptism. When the Israelites went out and picked up their daily quota of manna, manna was all over the ground. There was still a lot of manna left. Well, if there was no shortage of manna, why the quota? Why not let them pick up all they wanted? It's a difference between obedience and disobedience. God gave them a quota. Pick up this much. It doesn't matter how much is left over. It's got nothing to do with you. God gave you a quota. Will you do what the Lord said or not? And that's what he specifies here in this verse. It's as plain as the nose on our face. And what he is specifying here is implied in baptism because it's the same principle that's involved. I gave you a certain quota. Why? Because I wanted to test you. I wanted to see whether you will walk in my law or not. What was the law? The quota was the law. You don't think about a quota being a law. You think about loving your neighbor or loving your enemy. That's a law. But a quota on how much manna you can have. Anytime God gives us a charge, it's a law. What's a law? It's a rule of conduct. Here's how I want you to conduct yourself. Law. Anytime God tells us to do something, that is a law. And he gave this law, this certain quota, just to see if the Israelites would obey his law or not. Well, let's think about that a second. If the Lord knows everything, and there's nothing he doesn't know, if he knows the end from the beginning, why did he have to have a quota to find out whether or not the Israelites would obey him? Well, obviously he didn't. He knew what they would do. He's God. Whose sake was it for? for the Israelites, so they could see if they would obey God's law or not. And the same thing is true about baptism. And God gave a law. Will you do it or not? Most people won't do it, at least not for the right reason, not for remission of sin, not by immersion in water. Well, he gave a law. Why? He was testing people. Will you do what I told you to do or not? Now, let's go back to our other point regarding the day of judgment. A person goes to the day of judgment, and they're rejected by the law, and they say, well, why? And the Lord can point out, because I told you to be baptized, and you weren't baptized. Now there's a reason. They know why they're being rejected at least, and that's important too. A person's not going to be rejected in the day of the judgment being completely ignorant of their disobedience. They're going to know what their disobedience was. And there's going to be millions on top of millions of people who are going to be rejected because they refused to do what the Lord said when he told them to be baptized for the remission of sins. What excuse have they got? What reason can they give that they didn't do it? I told you to do it. Why didn't you do it? Well, it's only one reason, and that's unbelief. It's very sad, but it's very simple. It's very simple. The Lord gives us instructions, commands, whatever you want to call them, a law, to test us for our sake, so I can see, boy, I don't really believe God. If I did, I'd do what he told me to do. Now think about all the other things he wants us to do. He wants us to be a light to the world. I worked with a woman one time for years, and then one day I found out she was a Christian. I said, I can't believe I worked with you all these years and just now found out you were a Christian. And she said, well, I didn't want anybody to know. I said, why? She said, well, if people know I'm a Christian, they're going to expect me to live like one, act like one. Yeah, that kind of goes with it. But she kept it a secret. She wanted to go to church on Sunday, but she didn't want to have to live like it Monday through Saturday. One day she'll stand in judgment if she hasn't repented. I never could get through to her. What will her answer be? There's things that the Lord has told us to do. Every single thing, without exception, every single thing is a test of faith. That's why God gives us commands. If that weren't the case, God could have judged us righteously before he ever created us, because he knows the end from the beginning. Problem was, we didn't. So we're going through this thing we call life so that we can see who we are. We can know who we are. How? By looking at what the Lord has told us to do and whether or not we're willing to do what he wants us to do. Faith obeys God. Unbelief does not. It's just that simple. And it's heartbreaking, but it is that simple. Any questions? This is such an important point. So important, because very few people believe what I just said. Very few people believe it. It just doesn't seem right to be rejected for something that means nothing. The quota meant nothing, except that it was a test. Okay, now some took the divine test the wrong way, and this, I think, is pretty much the way with most all people. Job, he lost almost everything he had. His friends were no help at all. He said, you're miserable comforters. All of you are. How can you comfort me with your empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers? They were arguing with each other. Know then that God has wronged me. These are the words of Job. God has wronged me and has surrounded me with his net. If I cry out concerning wrong, I'm not heard. if I cry aloud, there is no justice. He, God, has fenced up my way, so I cannot pass. God has set darkness in my paths. God has stripped me of my glory and taken the crown from my head. God breaks me down on every side, and I am gone. My hope, God, is uprooted like a tree. God has also kindled his wrath against me. God counts me as one of his enemies. Job and company, they were at odds. Well, he was at odds with God, and they were at odds with each other because they were basing their arguments on a false premise. If the premise is false, the argument's going to be false. And that was the problem here. Their premise was faulty. They believed that God blesses good people with good things and that God punishes bad people with bad things. They thought that this is the way that God dealt with man. As long as you were living righteously, God's going to give you a lot of good stuff along the way, and he's not going to let any bad stuff come your way. That was their theology up to this point. It wasn't supposed to be. It wasn't their ancestors' theology. But somewhere along the line, as it often happens, their understanding of God changed, and they came up with this faulty belief system. Well, when Job, a righteous man, had things go wrong in his life, two things happened. Number one, Job's asking, where is God? I haven't done anything to deserve this. I don't think he would have admitted to being a perfect man, but he hadn't done anything that bad to warrant this kind of suffering. And then there was the false idea of his friends. Job must have committed some great sin. They thought his great sin had something to do with a woman. I don't know exactly what all the details were, but they thought he had been inappropriate in his behavior with a woman, and therefore God was punishing him. Well, why do you think I committed sin? He could ask. It's because God is punishing you. And if God is punishing you, you had to have done something bad. Job's thinking, he's looking over his life. I can't think of anything I did that's that bad. His conclusion is, therefore, God is wrong. Their conclusion is Job has done wrong because God doesn't do wrong. They're arguing over a faulty premise. If the premise isn't true, the argument isn't true either. That's as far as you got to go in debate. If you can establish that the premise is false, the argument is false. It falls right there. That's the way you debate the faith, belief in faith only, salvation by faith only. It's a faulty premise. And all you have to do is establish that the premise is faulty, and the argument's over. It's finished. You can't defend a faulty argument. That's what they were trying to do back at this time. But here's the bigger problem, and that was this. They drew the wrong conclusions. Job drew the wrong conclusions about God. He thought God isn't always righteous. God isn't always good. He isn't always fair. Sometimes God toys with us, causes us to suffer, watch our reaction, things of that nature. Job had some terrible thoughts about God. Now, these are thoughts, I believe, that Job wouldn't have entertained before his suffering came on him. But since it has come on him, this is the only conclusion he can draw, because he didn't do anything. And therefore God has to be wrong. And he starts making all these false assertions, to which he will eventually apologize. But his first reaction was, God isn't always fair. Now, Job came out and said it. A lot of people today won't say it, but they imply it by what they say. Why did God do this to me? That's the same thing Job said, except Job said God isn't always fair. Why didn't God do this to me? The implication is obviously God isn't always fair. He did something to me I didn't deserve. He did something to me that wasn't warranted. Why does God let me suffer? Well, that could be a good question. When you start thinking about the permissive will of God, sometimes God does let us suffer. But why? What's the answer? We know the answer. He uses suffering to educate us as to who we are, how strong our faith is, and a number of other things. We learn empathy. We learn compassion. We learn to be kind with people who are suffering when we suffer. A lot of advantages to suffering. We know what the advantages are, so we don't have to ask why. Why did God let this happen? God lets things happen because this, and this. We know what the reasons are. So we don't have to get angry. We don't have to feel abandoned by God. We don't have to feel like we're without hope, or that God isn't always honest, or that he's good. Now, most people, religious people included, they have adverse feelings about God because they don't know the reasons why God does the things he does, or allows the things he allows, I should say. But it's always in our best interest as far as the end game is concerned. Whatever I deal with in my life is always in my best interest. It's going to make me a better me if I can stay faithful. Now, Job had all kinds of bad thoughts about the Lord. But there's one thing about him. He never gave up on God. He thought he was unfair. He thought he was occasionally unrighteous. He thought that sometimes he used him for target practice. And despite all these bad feelings he had about God, Job never turned his back on God. He remained faithful. I don't understand what's happening. It looks to me like God isn't what he claims to be, but I'm not turning my back on God. I'm going to stick with him to the bittersweet end. That was what was in Job's mind. He endured, painfully he endured, probably for at least a year through all this suffering. And God extended mercy to Job in the form of a series of questions that allowed Job to see how small he really was and how big God really was. And that even though he didn't understand A from B, God did, and he was doing what was in Job's best interest. A lot of people will turn away from God, and that's when we cut off our nose to spite our face. I don't understand why this happened. Most people don't. I don't understand what benefit there could possibly be. Most people, they become angry with God. I want nothing more to do with God. Right there, you cut off your nose to spite your face. Because the God that we blame for our suffering is the God who can deliver us from our suffering. I don't understand why I hurt, but I'm not going to give up on God. That's the person that wins in the end, and the other person loses. It's easy to quit, especially when you feel like everything you've heard about God isn't true. He doesn't care. He doesn't listen to our prayer. He has no intention of helping us when we ask for help. I want nothing to do with him anymore. We just hurt ourselves in the process. And that's always very sad. Near the end, as he was drawing closer to the end, Job was becoming more and more angry. They said, "Have pity on me, have pity on me. You're my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." That's his resolve not to stop, not to quit. I don't think he liked God very much at this moment, but he wasn't going to give up on him. He wasn't going to walk away from him. He was the only person that could help him out, and he knew it. Though he slay me, though he put me in the grave, I'm still going to trust him that there's a better day coming. I don't understand what's going on. Nothing makes sense in my world anymore. Used to, everything was just clean and neat, and now everything's up in the air. He probably thought he was losing his mind, I guess. It was a horrible time for Job. Even so, I would defend my own ways before him. Job, he didn't give up on God. Nevertheless, he stayed his position. I haven't done anything to deserve this. And he would argue it even in a court of law if he had a chance, he said. Chapters 38 to 41 was divine grace in action. God asked Job a series of questions. And Job realized, he said, "You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge?" You ask for advice. You want to know what's going on, and yet you have no knowledge whatsoever, Job. Who is this person that does such a thing? Therefore, Job said, "I have uttered what I did not understand." Now he realizes how small he is. He could, well, even today, you go through that series of questions, and there's only about 3.5 questions that we can answer today with all of our technology. We still can't answer these questions that God asked. They're just beyond our ability to answer. I have uttered what I did not understand. In comparison to God, I'm as dumb as a box of rocks. Basically what he's talking about in our slang today. Things that are too wonderful for me. Things I did not know. Listen, please, let me speak. You said, I will question you. God will question Job. And Job, you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, God. But now, since I've been introduced to this series of questions and all these frustrating things going on in my life, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear. I had some acquaintance of you, God, but now my eye sees you. He understood God now better than he ever did before. He thought he had it all figured out, like a lot of people do. He thought he had all the answers. He knew exactly what he had to know. He knew what God was like. He knew what man was like. He had been blessed mightily through his life, and because he was a good man, everything was going good in his life. Other people were having problems, but that's because they were sinners. As far as Job was concerned, everything was just fine. He had every I dotted and T crossed. Everything was in order, just as it ought to be. Suddenly, everything's out of order. Nothing makes sense. The world's gone crazy. And then God shows him just how ignorant he is with a series of questions. And Job is humbled. He is greatly humbled. He was so smart, he thought, and now he sees just how ignorant he really was and is. He said, I charged God, and I didn't have a clue what I was talking about. I was talking about things I didn't even understand. I had an acquaintance with God, but now I see him much more clearly. I have a better understanding of God. Therefore, I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Anytime we compare ourselves to God, we're going to come up short. We're going to come up very short. Whenever we compare ourselves to God, we're going to come up ignorant, very ignorant, terribly ignorant. We're going to realize how little we really understand. Well, I've studied the Bible for 50 years. Oh, that's good. God wrote it. No matter what, we're going to come up short. No matter how smart we think we are, no matter how well we think we understand God, we're going to come up short. Because God is just that big. I think if we knew 5% of what God knows, I think our head might blow up. I don't know if we could hold all that in there. We're trying to compare genius to ourselves, and you just can't do that. There's no scale that you can measure by. This is what Job learned, and he detested himself for the way he acted when he talked about God. Habakkuk, there's another one. He understood, he was a prophet. He understood, or he thought, there's too much sin in Israel. It's about like we feel about our country today. Too much sin in America. That's where Habakkuk was at. Why does God let this happen? Why does he allow all this sin? It just doesn't seem right. O Lord, how long shall I cry, and you will not hear? I've asked and asked and asked, you've done nothing about it. Even cry out to you violence, and you will not save. Why do you show me sin and cause me to see trouble? For plundering and violence are ever before me. There is strife and contention arises. Therefore the law is powerless. What good's law? It doesn't do any good. Justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore perverse judgment proceeds. How long do I have to cry out to you, God, before you will do something? It doesn't make sense to Habakkuk. But he went from the pan into the fire, beginning in verse 5. He said, are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die. O Lord, you have appointed them for judgment. O Rock, you have marked them for correction. You are pure eyes than to behold evil. You cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously? Why, God, do you hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? What kind of justice is this, God? Well, I didn't put it in. I probably should have. Habakkuk got his answer. God was in process of raising up someone to punish Israel for her sins. Like America, she was steeped in sin. And Habakkuk cried and cried, as did many other righteous, I'm sure, for God to intervene, to do something about all this sin. And the whole time, God was developing a plan by which he would punish Israel. He was raising up the Assyrians. He was making them powerful, strong, so that they could come and punish Israel for her sins. Well, when Habakkuk found out what the Lord was doing, he almost had a heart attack. I wanted something. I didn't want that. I didn't want a foreign government to invade us. I didn't want that. I just wanted to quit sinning. Well, God wanted to quit sinning too, and this is the way he was going to go about it. He would bring in the Assyrians, and the Assyrians would stop the sin in Israel. Of course, the consequences of that was going to be tough. But This was the way he would stop the sin in Israel. Then Habakkuk went to backpedaling real quick. Anyway, that's for another time. Secondly, some of the advantages to wean people from the world. Trials can strip away worldly resources, the things we believe in. A person trusts in gold until they lose their health. And they're on the verge of dying. And there's no one can help them. What good is the gold then? The God of a person that is gold can be dethroned very quickly when they lose their health in such a case. It's not important anymore. It can't deliver. It can't help. And the same thing can be said about anything else. Once the power of our God is stripped away from us, we instantly start looking for another God. And in our culture, I think most likely the God people will seek will be Jesus Christ, because he's the one that's most enduring. So sometimes a person suffers by losing health. A singer could lose their voice. An athlete could lose their limbs. There's so many things that we might lean on as our key to success that can be taken away from us. And if it is, we look for something to replace it. So it's possible that a person could lose their legs as a means of trying to save them from what might have been their fate. What seems like the most awful thing that could possibly happen could actually turn out to be the best day in their life. They might live in a wheelchair the rest of their life, but they might live with God through eternity. And that might not have happened had the worst day of their life hadn't occurred. We don't know. We just don't know the answers to everything. In John 6:5-6, Jesus lifted his eyes, seeing a great multitude coming toward him. He asked Philip, "Where should we buy bread? How are we going to feed all these people, Philip?" And he said this to test him, for Jesus knew what he would do. He already had the answer to it. He didn't need Philip's input. He just wanted to see if Philip had learned anything since he'd been traveling with him. And, well, he had. Third, to call his people to their heavenly hope. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. This has been a passage, this has been one of my fondest passages for a number of years now. I've relied on this many times, especially when I become a little bit angry. I'll go back to what Paul wrote to the Corinthians. It works for us. It's helping us overcome obstacles. While we do not look at the things which are seen, not in an affliction you don't, that gold don't matter anymore. What good is it? We look at the things which are not seen. We look beyond the pale of the world, and we look into heaven itself. The things which are seen, well, they're temporary, and we know that now. The suffering know that now. But the things which are not seen, these are the eternal things, the lasting things. Fourth, troubles in the world can reveal our true love. We may not even know what it is, but we got to stop because trouble's back. I'm playing. How'd you like to be little again? You ever think about that? Look at there. You ain't got a care in the world. You crawl up in Mama's arms and take a nap. Got it made. We'll begin again next week.